Today we're starting a new read aloud. We had finished Investigators yesterday, so today we are beginning Paul Bunyan Swings His Axe, and that is in honor of lumberjacks, and we're going to see what Paul Bunyan has to do with this. This falls into the category of a tall tale. It's an exaggeration. Everything in this is exaggerated. So as you read today, I want you to think of some things that might be exaggerated. Let's begin reading. Paul Bunyan Swings His Axe. By the way, this book is very old. My pages are falling apart. Chapter 1. Paul Bunyan and his boyhood. Many tales are told of Paul Bunyan and the giant woodsman, mightiest hero of the Northwoods, a man of great size and strength. He was taller than the trees of the forest. He had such strength in his huge arms that they say he could take the tallest pine and break it in two with his bare hands. They tell of his mighty deeds and strange adventures from Maine to California. He could outrun the swiftest deer and cross the widest river in one great stride. Even today, lumberjacks who work in the woods find small lakes and point them out, saying, "Those are the footprints of Paul Bunyan that have been filled with water." A giant logger was Paul, and he chopped down whole forests in a single day. And he and his woodsmen logged off North Dakota in a single month. His axe was as wide as a barn door and had a great oak tree for a handle. It took 6 full-grown men to lift it. They say that he was born in Maine, and even as a baby, he was so large that his mother and father had to have 14 cows to supply milk for his porridge. Every morning when they looked at him, he had grown 2 feet taller. They built a huge cradle for Paul and floated it in the ocean off the coast of Maine. The ocean waves would rock him to sleep. One day he started bouncing up and down in his cradle and started a 70-foot tidal wave that washed away towns and villages. After that, Paul's folks gave up the idea of a floating cradle and took Paul with them into the Maine woods. Here they felt he could be kept out of mischief. Paul spent his boyhood in the woods and helped his father cut down trees. They sawed the trees into logs and tied them together into large rafts, which were floated down the river to the sawmills. Even as a boy, he had the strength of 12 men and could ride a raft through the wildest parts of the river. One day, the man at the sawmill refused to buy the logs. They were too large for his mill and cut up into lumber. So Paul chained them together again and pulled the raft back up the river to his father's camp. Imagine his dad's surprise to see young Paul wading up the river, towing the great raft of logs behind him. Everybody liked young Paul, and for miles around they told of his great feats of strength, of how he took an iron crowbar and bent it into a safety pin to hold together a rip in his trousers, of how at another time he came to the end of the field he was plowing with 2 oxen, and having no room to turn the plow and the oxen around, he picked up the plow, oxen, and all. Yet Paul never boasted. When people asked him how strong he was, he just laughed. And when Paul laughed, the folks in the villages ran into their houses and hid in the cellars, thinking it was a thunderstorm. In spite of his huge size, Paul was as quick as lightning. They say he was the only man in the woods who could blow out a candle at night and hop into bed before it was dark. That would be quite interesting. Blow out the candle, get there before it gets blown out? Woo. Being so quick on his feet was once his undoing. He was out in the woods hunting one day and shot at a bear. Paul was anxious to see if he had hit it and ran lickety-split toward it. only to get there before the shot he had fired. As a result, he received a full load of buckshot in the seat of his breeches. Not too smart to run that fast. When Paul was grown, he decided he wanted to become the greatest lumberjack in America and perform great feats of logging. He dreamed of leading his men through wondrous adventures in the great forest of the West. Chapter 2, Babe the Blue Ox. One day when Paul was working in his father's logging camp in the Maine woods, it started to snow. Day after day, the soft, fluffy snowflakes fell until the entire camp was covered with a blanket of snow. Log cabins disappeared from sight, and all but the tallest trees were buried under the great snow drifts. Think about last winter. It's even deeper than that. And the strangest thing of all was that the snow, instead of it being white, was a bright sapphire blue. For miles and miles, as far as one could see, the forest was covered with beautiful blue snow. Loggers even today remember that year and called it the Winter of Blue Snow. When the snow had stopped falling, Paul put on his snowshoes and went out to find wood for his fireplace. As he was returning, he noticed two little ears sticking up through the snowdrift. It must be some poor animal lost and freezing to death, thought Paul. He reached down with one of his great hands and scooped up the little thing out of the snow. It was a baby ox calf with thin, wobbly legs. Paul put the little calf inside one of his large pockets and took him home. Soon he was curled up in front of the fireplace and as happy and as warm as could be. "Poor little baby," said Paul, as the little calf drank some warm milk and gratefully caressed Paul's hand with his tongue. Paul decided to call the little calf Babe and to keep him for a pet. The strangest thing about Babe was that even after he became thawed out, his coat remained a soft, glossy blue. Paul nursed his new pet back to health, but his color never changed. The winter of blue snow had colored him blue, and blue he remained forever. Babe followed Paul wherever he went and grew larger each day. Every time Paul looked around, the little calf seemed to have grown a foot taller. In the spring, Paul built a little barn for Babe and put the calf inside for the night. The next morning, the barn was gone, and so was the little blue calf. Paul searched high and low. Finally, he found Babe calmly eating grass in a neighboring valley, with the barn perched right up on his back. He had outgrown it in a single night. Paul became very fond of Babe and took him on all of his adventures in the woods. The calf grew by leaps and bounds and soon was almost as large as Paul himself. Woodsmen tell us that when Babe was full grown, he measured 42 axe handles between the eyes. His appetite was tremendous. Every evening he ate 1.5 tons of hay. That's 3,000 pounds. Even then, he wouldn't be satisfied to go to bed unless he had 3 wagon loads of turnips for dessert. Paul taught him to help with the logging in the woods and would give him the 80-pound lump of sugar if he had been a good ox during the day. Babe was always full of mischief, however. He liked to roar and stamp his feet at night, so the men would run out of the bunkhouses where they slept, thinking it was an earthquake. When Paul scolded him for it, Babe only chuckled and pretended he was asleep. Once, when Babe was standing beside the cookhouse, he winked at Paul and put his head in the cookhouse window. Babe gave a great sneeze and blew a whole barrel of flour over Hot Biscuit Slim, the cook, and his helper, Cream Puff Fatty. Babe was very useful in many ways. For instance, Paul had a lot of trouble with the crooked, twisting road that wound in and out through the forest. He finally tied one end of the road to the large stump and hitched Babe to the other end of the large logging chain. Babe dug his great hoofs in the ground and strained and tugged until he pulled the entire road out straight. It was a mighty feat of strength. In doing it, he stretched the heavy iron links of the logging chain until it was a single iron bar. Can you imagine that, stretching out the chains until it became a bar instead? Wow. Down to the last paragraph. During his first summer, Babe became fat and lazy and one day refused to pull the logs down the road to the river. He wanted to wait until winter when the snow was on the ground and logs would slide easier. Paul didn't say a word, but that night he had the men secretly whitewash the roads. The next morning, Babe thought it was snow and pulled the logs without further trouble. When winter finally came again and covered the Maine woods with beautiful white snow, Babe was the happiest ox in the world. He loved to roam through the woods on the new snowshoes that Paul had given him for his first birthday. The greatest trouble Paul had that winter was finding enough food for Babe, who was getting thin. One day he thought of a good idea and called Ole the big Swede. Ole was the camp blacksmith, and next to Paul, the largest man in camp. Ole, he said, I want you to make the largest pair of green eyeglasses in the world. When Ole finished, Paul put the glasses on Babe, strapping them over his nose. He then turned Babe out into the snow again. To Babe, with his new green glasses, all the snow looked like nice green grass. He ate and grew fat and healthy again in no time at all. In all the woods, there was no one so kindly toward Babe as Paul Bunyan, and no ox was ever as faithful to its master as Babe, the famous blue ox. We will continue with the adventures of Paul Bunyan swinging his axe tomorrow.